want to give a huge round of applause to Mace, our first speaker. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So today I want to talk about what I'm calling the vehicle indeterminacy problem in neuroscience. And this is a problem in theorizing about mental representations. And these are just, when you're thinking about mental representations or when you're positing them, what you're trying to explain are things like mental pictures and imagination, something like a percept you have about the world, you're using concepts, the ability to navigate using cognitive maps, and just thinking generally. And when trying to theories about mental representations, it's really common to distinguish between the content of the representation and vehicles. So the content's what the representation is about or what it refers to, and the vehicles are particulars that bear those contents. So I'll go with an example to make this a little more intuitive, but you can think of something like a map that you're using to navigate a city where the content is going to be contents in that city like streets or landmarks, and the vehicles are going to be lines and symbols that you're interpreting. Now, when we're applying this to the brain, there's a number of different ways that people have carved it out, but a really common way to think about it is that neurons and their activities are vehicles. So you can talk about neurons themselves being vehicle realizers and their activities also being part of the vehicle, and those implementing or realizing representational contents. And classically, when people conceive or theories about mental representations, they run into problems with content determinacies. There's been debates for decades about content and how to determine what the content of a particular representation in the brain is. And this is the problem of assigning determinate contents when some class or disjunction of determinate contents are fitting. And so theories appeal to different kinds of criteria to say that if the classic case is a toad using prey capture behavior and is representing flies or toad food or small moving black dots. And the idea is that we can explain the behavior in better or worse capacity by positing any of those. Now, the indeterminacy problem is a problem insofar as naturalistic accounts of mental representation should render content determinate to explain things like misrepresentation. So if the toad takes the bee in the first frame there to be a fly, we would want to explain, like positing content is a way to explain this. So an outstanding issue with representational theory is developing an account that renders content determinate, and decades of debate have focused on this. But this leaves us unsure about whether representational vehicles should be treated similarly. And so this is the focus of what I'll be talking about today. Vehicle determinacy is the problem of determining which patterns of neural activity are representational vehicles. And as we're specifying in advance, I take this to be a problem for vehicle realists. So this is a problem I'm raising for philosophers who hold a view about vehicles, and not a criticism of neuroscience, but I do think that we can draw out lessons about neuroscientific practice and so forth from what I'm saying today. So just to clarify here. Okay, so to make my case, I'm going to introduce representational vehicles and their explanatory role in neuroscience. Then I'm going to introduce vehicle realism and show that vehicle realism is unmotivated on numerous criteria for scientific realism. And this is because of the vehicle indeterminacy problem, which is a radical epistemic indeterminacy about the relevant properties of representational vehicles. I'm going to develop a response from vehicle realists because they might launch an objection based on an appeal to something like computational theory in the sciences. Which is just to say, maybe we need to know about vehicles to posit them as real entities or theoretical entities. But I'll respond to that objection and then raise a brief thought or two about how we might resolve vehicle indeterminacy before concluding. Okay, so to get an understanding of representational vehicles, this is a map of the San Diego Zoo. Representational vehicles play an important explanatory role in representational theory. So they're the means by which a representation can occur at all. So this is a public representation by which I might use to try to figure out, maybe I want to see the gorillas and the baby giraffe, and there's like a baboon exhibit, and I want to figure out how I can visit all of those things within a limited amount of time before the zoo closes. This is like a real story that happened. And I can use the map to try to plan my route using convention about things I know about maps, and also there's a legend there. And so the lines and symbols allow me to use this as a representation. It's how the representation can occur. Right, and yeah, without the vehicles, I wouldn't be able to form my own representation of the zoo. Now, in neuroscience, representational vehicles play a similar explanatory role. They're the physical or physically realized structures and processes in the brain, which I'll refer to sometimes as patterns, to which other areas of the brain can respond appropriately for producing some cognitive or behavioral output. So I realize it's kind of a confusing slide. That arrow is just because there will be some other part of the brain that's responding to it, and then the animal or organism is representing the world. And so this is the explanatory role here. And as physical or physically realized entities, vehicles have causal powers for eliciting responses in those other parts of the brain and downstream in behavior and cognition. And in neuroscience, these patterns are typically called neural representations. You might be familiar with that phrase. Now, performing a representational role, as I conceive of it, is to have properties to which a downstream area of the brain is sensitive and for which that downstream area can elicit or contribute to a cognitive or behaviorally relevant response. So in this way, vehicles are postulated to explain how aspects and features of the world external to an organism, as well as those of organisms' bodily or cognitive states, can be what's internally represented, as some people say, as a mental representation, and thereby explain how we can account for all these aspects and features when acting and remembering and thinking about the world. So just very briefly, it's worth going through a kind of schematic for how these vehicles are identified in neuroscience. So typically researchers will use a behavioral paradigm, which is used to isolate some variable for which there should be a neural representation or a vehicle for the behavior to be successful. So there's many of these kinds of behavioral paradigms. This one here is just a monkey that's being conditioned to press a response bar whenever a certain stimulus appears on the screen, and it's receiving a reward, so it knows when to press the response bar. And the idea is that in certain uses of this behavioral paradigm, it'll make sense to posit a representation that carries information about the stimulus, and that's how it explains how the monkey can perform the particular task. So then what researchers might do is identify activities correlated with that task-relevant behavior. There's a number of techniques used to do this and collect data about neural activity. And researchers might want to go beyond this for various reasons. The correlation could be spurious, or the activity could be performing some related but non-representational role. So it's helpful to try to establish that the activity has a causal role. And there's a whole other set of tools that can do this. The ones on the far left are more commonly used they're only used in animals. I think maybe Object X is used in a human once, but this is usually research that is done in animals and other organisms than humans. But the idea is that we establish a causal role for the pattern of neural activity, and then ideally that pattern will be re-identified over time. So here, this is a pattern being identified over days. It might be identified in other brains of the same species, or in other brains in other animals, and with other tools. And so this is just a schematic about how neuroscientists might go about finding vehicles. Okay, so with that in hand, I will now turn to vehicle realism and scientific realism. So as I'm thinking about it, scientific realism is generally the view that entities, kinds, or structures postulated by scientists or posited in scientific theories are real, or that they approximate real entities, kinds, or structures. And as science progresses, the idea is that these entities, kinds, or structures will be ones that actually exist in the world. So why be a vehicle realist? At minimum, the thought seems to be that patterns of neural activity have causal structure, and we should be realists about that causal structure in the brain. But to call such patterns vehicles is to make a claim about the particular causal role that patterns of neural activity have, which is namely that the causal role involves content, even if that content's evolved essentially as an explanatory gloss, like someone like Frankie Egan would say. For this reason, I accept a formulation of vehicle realism as the view that contents can be justifiably ascribed to particular parts and processes. So neuroscientists set up their experiments to provide this warrant about content, and in this way, vehicle realism appeals to scientific realism. So what vehicle realism should show is that scientific realism supports vehicle realism. So I'll go through a number of criteria for scientific realism to see how vehicles fare. Okay, so in the strongest case, we should be realists about scientific entities because we know exactly what they are. So for example, we should be realists about cells because after much observation and theorizing, we know the typical properties, we know their typical componentry, and for many cells, how they perform the various roles into which they enter. And we can identify various kinds of cells, intervene on them to induce certain outcomes, and even create them in the lab. So in the strongest case, we should be realists about things like cells. But vehicle realism cannot meet this criterion. To put the point quite bluntly, we do not know which properties in the brain are vehicle properties, much less their typical properties. Indeed, for any particular representation instance, it's indeterminate what in the brain is the vehicle. So this is the vehicle determinacy problem, and I'll be fleshing this out as we go along. It's the problem of determining which patterns or properties of patterns bear representational content, especially given the fact that many candidates are equally fitting. So the goal of scientific inquiry, you might think, is to figure out which patterns or properties of patterns bear representational content. And given this, you might think, well, okay, it's reasonable to be realist about entities. We don't know all their typical properties, but maybe we just need a slightly weaker criterion. And here I'm thinking something like robust detection. So robust detection is the identification of an entity by various independent means of detection. So hypothetical entities that are posited can be considered real to the extent that they may be observed over time in different situations, in different contexts, with different measurements or tools by different people. So as a methodological dictum, the thought is that each means of detection increases the warrant of our claim that the entity is real. This is because errors or noises or artifacts from any particular detection method ideally will be eliminated in the amalgamate. So we'll have an idea of what the actual entity is. This is to say that with robust detection, the entity is unlikely to be some manufactured artifact or some error of any particular means of detection. So it's a means of confirming that the entity is real. Now, I don't mean to suggest that robust detection or re-identification alone would be sufficient to establish realism. So everyday cases that show us this would be unjustified. You could think of something like the legendary Bigfoot in the northern coast of California, who's been putatively robustly detected by various different means. There have been stories, there's been plaster casts of huge footprints, there's been film footage. Yes, some might feel justified in denying that Bigfoot exists. And the problem is that the postulation of some common factor to explain these cases is misguided when the alternative, which is generous storytelling and manufactured evidence, is a better explanation. So what's needed for robust detection to get off the ground is an indication that the robust detection more meaningfully converges on the hypothetical entity than some alternative. Okay, so here lies the problem. Re-identification of putative vehicles relies on similarity in respects that are problematically and arbitrarily tied to current tool use and theories of brain function. So here I have a bunch of images of neuronal ensembles. They're identified by different means, but I'm going to focus on a particular method, which is using green fluorescent protein to identify neuronal ensembles. And so what this technique does, you genetically engineer animals so that so a common way to do is to track a gene and tag that gene so that the neurons shine fluorescent green. There's certain lighting, and it shows that the neurons were active because that gene was active. So it's a way of showing that certain neurons were active in some particular time. And really, this is just an illustration of trying to pick out what are called neuronal ensembles. These are functional units in the brain that are taken to be neural representations. And so on a cursory assessment, you might ask by what criteria ensembles should be re-identified to establish that they've been robustly detected. So for example, we might wonder about uncertainties like if the pattern of activity is the spatial configuration of active neurons, whether it's active and inactive neurons, whether the synaptic connections between the active and inactive neurons in a given area are the vehicle. One possibility is that we should look for the same number of neurons within a brain region. But these options seem pretty stringent given that there's a lot of individual variation from brain to brain and even within a brain from moment to moment. We might also wonder what the boundaries of the pattern are, if it's local to a cluster or a brain region or the entire brain, and how to carve out what matters in a population of neurons. Now in practice, similarity is measured typically, as I've seen, they'll measure the percentage of neurons that are active in a particular area. So they'll say, well, 40% reactive here, 40% reactive here, so it's the same kind of ensemble. And that's an example of something where I think where you're re-identifying by criterion that's unlikely to be relevant for vehicle status. And so this is what I have in mind for saying that re-identification is kind of arbitrarily tied to like the current methods available to neuroscientists. And the worry is that re-identification in such respects is based on a relevant similarity or similarity shared among patterns that are not representational vehicles. Now you can say the same thing about more temporally identified vehicles. So here we're looking at neurons firing and what are called spikes over time. There's numerous ways to measure these spikes. Right, so these are like sequences of spikes that are being measured in a neuron or with numerous neurons. And this is used to correlate with certain stimuli. So classically, the orientation of a bar has been correlated with what are called tuning curves of neurons. So a neuron is firing a lot when a particular stimulus is present. Also, neural activity spikes have been correlated with shape, texture, color of various objects. As shown here, all the various objects here. You'll see the neuron fires more for certain objects. And the idea is that if the neuron fires more with a representation of a particular stimulus, that it seems to track that stimulus or perhaps carry information about it for other parts of the brain. Now, indeterminacy already exists identifying the particular vehicle of interest. So we might ask if the vehicle is individual spikes, if it's spike trains, if it's firing rate compared to some baseline. And there's active debate about what the vehicle is in this case. Then what the vehicle is here makes a difference for all sorts of computational analyses that rely on spiking and spike rates. So if the vehicle is the firing rate, you can average the spikes, but not if the vehicle requires precise timing. Similarly, some population models abstract away the precise timing of spikes. So they'll capture the vehicle only if the vehicle is the firing rate. And when you look at the neural population, which some take to exhibit coordinate activity, where a population of neurons is really the vehicle, the questions arise as to whether you can sample from individual neurons to approximate population activity or sample across various trials. And so there's all these questions that arise when it's not really clear what the vehicle is. And this matters for knowing what should be re-identified. Okay. So it's no surprise that re-identification is difficult. It's difficult for various reasons. The number one thing being the brain is complex and plastic, so things change in the brain all the time. There's things moving around. It's like causal soup, as some people have called it. Neural states are dynamic. There's also difficulties with like the behavioral paradigm. When you're training on a task, there's often reorganization of neural activity that indicates that the animal is learning the task. There's significant individual variation in brains that make re-identification difficult. And then when you're trying to re-identify across tools, the problem is that tools detect various different features of a pattern of neural activity and may pick up patterns that other tools don't. So given all this, one might just say, like, look, okay, well, vehicles are not the kind of thing to be re-identified. After all, how can we identify an entity across different contexts if the entity changes over time or varies across individuals? I think this is too quick because we can make claims about plasticity and individual variation just because there is some entity that varies and is plastic. So, for example, you can think of dendritic spines in synapses. They must be re-identified to say that they've changed shape. And so it's not the case that just this kind of plasticity undermines robust detection. And I'm not just presenting like a mere object indeterminacy that we're not quite sure what the object is. I don't mean to go there. But just to say that these kinds of issues do not rule out robust analysis or robust detection. And we might even think that patterns are routinely and even trivially re-identified across experimental contexts. Indeed with various methods and different modalities. And I think that's right. Neuroscientists do re-identify patterns. The problem is in determining that the determinate structures are vehicles. So here it's just a diagram. We could think about what's called the fusiform face area there. And we might think that we are probing the fusiform phase area to find hemodynamic changes or gamma and alpha oscillations or spiking activity, various other patterns of neural activity. And one might suggest that what researchers are doing is converging on some structure with these different modalities or methods. And that indicates robust detection of some as yet unknown structure. And so the idea is that, well, we should be realists about vehicles because there's something there, and all those methods are converging on it. Now, while this might be sufficient to support a realism about that structure, I think it's insufficient to support a realism about that structure as a vehicle. So one might take it that these different methods themselves, like gamma oscillations themselves or spiking activity, are themselves vehicles rather than them converging on a vehicle. So as for robust detection, I want to say that without knowledge about what properties are relevant for identifying and individuating vehicles, we're left unsure how to establish that those vehicles are being re-identified across contexts and methods of analysis. Now, of course, we might adopt a slightly weaker realistic criterion because it's reasonable to be realist about things that are only detected once. So there's black hole collisions or pocket sharks and things like this that we think like, okay, well, those need to be robustly detected for us to be realist about them. And there's two different ways you might get a signal detection off the ground. And you might think, well, we have very good tools for identifying vehicles. For example, we're realists about tables, chairs, and other medium-sized dry goods that we detect only once because our sensors are very good at detecting these kinds of things. Now, such reliability in science is not often easily achieved. So granting the microscope of the reliability has now required decades of debate about which observations were artifacts, which microscopic entities were real, and we still would be suspicious of entities only detected once with a microscope. So appealing to any one method as the arbiter of vehicle status would be an unwarranted decision with no tool-independent means of identifying vehicles. So this is a problem in calibrating the tool to detect the hypothetical entity. And developing such a tool, I want to say leads to an experimenter's regress. So here I'm thinking of Colin's work, where we want to determine whether the pattern is a real vehicle. So we have this tool that we think is very efficacious to identify the vehicle. But then to establish that the tool identifies real vehicles, and you know the patterns identifies the real vehicles, and you get into this regress and trying to understand whether we actually have a good tool for identifying vehicles. Right, and so an independent criterion is needed to break into the circle, and until vehicle indeterminacy is resolved, we don't know what independent criterion tells us that we have a very good vehicle detector. Okay, now the second means of establishing real entities is manipulation view. If we can manipulate the entity or use it for manipulation, then it's real. And so this is Ian Hacking, Nancy Cartwright, and Vincent Ney's work. So we can confidently claim that something is real if we can intervene on it to cause effects. And much neuroscientific evidence can attest to the fact that something in the brain is involved in representing the world. So loss of hippocampal tissue results in failure to remember details about one's life, as you've seen with HM. Stimulation of reward circuitry results in self-stimulation of that circuitry in various animals. And then activating previously activated populations of neurons results in something like memory retrieval. Now, the problem, as I've been emphasizing, is determining what has these causal powers. So while fascinating neuroscientific research and innovations allows researchers to manipulate various structures and processes in the brain to observe their effects, such interventions remain coarse-grained and inexact. So causal intervention in the brain always affects other variables, including other candidate vehicles. And this means that the causal variables are themselves indeterminate. What's missing in all of this is a theory that explains how tissues, circuits, populations of neurons, or synaptic processes carry information and represent the world. So as it stands, vehicle realism is supported by a very weak realist criterion, which is that there's some unknown entity that can be indirectly manipulated. Now, you might then turn to the idea that our best scientific theories postulate vehicles. There are familiar arguments against this criterion based on induction from failed scientific theories and underdetermination. But realists may similarly draw on the success of scientific theories. So I think as we're saying more here about whether theory realism can substantiate vehicle realism. And so the way that this is kind of cashed out is that vehicles are posited in a well-confirmed scientific explanation of observable phenomena like behavior. Okay, so I'll turn to computational theories in neuroscience, which is where vehicle realism draws its support. Okay. So a common view in cognitive science is that the brain computes over representations to produce cognitive or behavioral outputs. And the computational descriptions of these parts and processes provides a means to type individuate them and understand their computational properties. So here's a kind of an adapted version of mapping relation between the brain and vehicles and contents, as shown in Francis Egan's recent book. And the idea is that you have these physical realizers that realize vehicles, representational vehicles, and those are identified by, with some computational description that's supposed to explain a mental representation. And so it's really dark on the screen, but the top picture there is supposed to be edges. This is supposed to be Mars' theory of edge detection shown here. And the idea is that the computational descriptions will provide a way to identify vehicles. And so to substantiate vehicle realism, the idea is that we should have the right computational description of the system to go find those vehicles. And I don't think this is the case, basically. So my objection is that any token pattern of neural activity can be interpreted as computing a particular computation. So if you go in with a computation in mind, you're going to be able to map it to any neural activity in the brain. And so here I'm just drawing on criticisms from Hilary Putnam and others that you can interpret any kind of object as a computational device or as computing. And this is problematic because of vehicle indeterminacy. So vehicle indeterminacy makes mappings trivial, thereby calling into question whether the computation can be confirmed. Good, yeah. So, but much of computational neuroscience does not work from a computational theory. So here I'm thinking about, and Egan is thinking about theories like David Marr's theory of vision or Shadmir Mize's theory of like pointing and reaching behaviors in monkeys. And it's just not the case that computational neuroscientists work with a big theory like this and then go try to apply it. Often they're trying to develop computational models. But even those theories kind of just give a how possibly story, I think, about how the brain possibly represents the world. In any case, I want to turn to the computational models and methods that don't have the overarching theory, because I think that's a more common method used in contemporary computational neuroscience. So this is where argument gets both less certain and a bit technical, and so I want to invite people to jump in if I'm not being clear, because it might be because it's too technical or because my argument is like not great. So the difficulty in discerning a pattern computationally is that you're looking at hundreds of neurons and lots of activity, maybe even thousands of neurons at this point. And the activity of individual neurons may be redundant, they might be artifactual, or they might be insignificant for the collective activity in the whole brain or the whole population. So hypothetically, because only some neurons need to be analyzed to account for the activity of the population, the number of dimensions can be reduced to express the data in more simplified form. And so this is what's shown on the bottom here. It's one way that this is done. So researchers do this with statistical methods that reduce the dimensionality of the population's activity. So rather than describe the population activity across thousands of dimensions, as you would do as would be the case with describing the activity of thousands of individual neurons, we get a mathematical description of the activity across a few dimensions. So here across 3 dimensions. Researchers can distinguish population activity correlating with a task parameter from population activity correlating with another task parameter by the association. So on the right here is a very famous study using this technique where the researchers were able, the task was a monkey was trying to track something like the motion of a stimulus, the color of the stimulus, depending on the task context. And the researchers could distinguish population activity correlating with each of those 3 task conditions. And so the question we might ask then is what the vehicle is in studies like this. And there's a lot of different options. I've thought of a few. There might be more. Some of them might be redundant. But we can say that, well, it's the full high-dimensional pattern of firing rates across recorded neurons. That's the vehicle. Or it might be the low-dimensional trajectory through some state space. It might be those demixed subspaces tied to specific task parameters. It could be a particular set of principal components or latent variables. It could be some differently constructed manifold or some attractor geometry or something else. There's a lot of ways that researchers might try to approximate what the neural activity is doing, and it's not clear the vehicle is. Now, you might be thinking in this case this is an empirical question. So something we can do is we can intervene on the population of neurons to affect changes and thereby observe any changes in the resulting task behavior. And the problem is that all of these candidates will change as a result. So pattern activity across the population of neurons is noisy, and discerning a meaningful pattern takes treating some features as signal and others as noise. So for some techniques, it's unclear how to interpret changes in activity. So with some methods, you might add more neurons, and then the shape or the geometry changes. Because it's not clear which neurons should be included, it's not clear whether you should interpret the changes as a better or worse approximation of the vehicle or a new vehicle altogether. So for the techniques discussed here, scientists work contrastively. They distinguish activities for particular contents. And this is, of course, very good science, and it's useful, but it's insufficient to establish what the vehicles are and why we should be realistic about them. So without knowing in advance which details matter, these computational techniques leave it indeterminate what the vehicle is, and that's whether the brain literally computes over that vehicle. Okay, so I want to very briefly gesture at ways I think that we can resolve vehicle indeterminacy. This would just be, there's a couple methods I thought of. One would be bootstrapping theories of vehicles. And they're, well, I should say what I think when I take that to be. So I have in mind placeholder hypotheses that stipulate what the vehicle properties are in the brain, and then it provides a basis for testing those hypotheses. And I want to say that there's many of these floating around. There's, there's theories of spikes, and there's a whole book called Spikes that is presenting this theory. And so it's the primary case of what I have in mind. And the idea is to see which hypotheses fare better, and I take it this is what neuroscience is already up to. This is what the neuroscientific inquiry is. Now, theories of particular computations, like the ones I mentioned earlier, might provide clues about vehicles. If you have like an idea of how things might be computed, it might tell you what kinds of structures and properties to look for, so they can serve, this can serve another kind of bootstrapping role, I think. But then we can also just appeal to researchers' aims and goals. So we can, so these are ways that I think that we can resolve vehicle determinacy, and importantly, that supports a pragmatism about vehicles rather than a realism about vehicles. So that vehicle pragmatism just looks like the idea that, well, so I got this question once. The question was like, well, vehicles are postulated all the time, and scientists are happy with that work. Isn't that enough? And I'm like, yeah, that's totally enough, because they have various purposes that aren't just like finding vehicles that philosophers are happy with. So I don't think this vindicates vehicle realism. Whether the methods neuroscientists use to pick out real vehicles is in dispute, and vehicle individuation with computational methods might gloss over relevant vehicle properties. Okay, so to conclude, just briefly what my uptake is. So vehicle indeterminacy is a local practice-bound indeterminacy of the kind faced by many early-stage sciences that are still developing theories to individuate vehicle kinds. And I just think this is the state that neuroscience is in. So as a dictum of vehicle realism, the idea is that we should be realist about the fact that neurons and neural processes are representational vehicles, but in debate about representations is exactly the fact that's under dispute. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for some questions. Anybody have them for her? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. Great talk. So I guess I couldn't agree more with the logic of the argument.
Great.
But I think I'm still confused about some parameters. So the argument seems to be we cannot individuate vehicles carefully enough. There's a vagueness in the concept, so we can be realist about them. But are you committed to some sort of anti-realism about it, or we are on defense? Because like most other early stages sciences, like Darwin when he developed his theory, he was like, there might be some things like genes that are variations that inherit over time. He had no idea what he was talking about, and then it took us a few decades to actually know what are the genetic and molecular mechanisms of evolution. So if I was a philosopher of science at the time of Darwin, I was like, I'm going to be anti-realist about what you call genes. That would have been a little bit of a stretch. But are you like, I'm on we don't have to be either realist or anti-realist, or like, let's be anti-realist for now?
No, this is a great question.
Yeah.
I think genes are a really great analogy here because, then decades, people were trying to find the structures that perform that particular role. I think this is what's happening here. So I guess my answer that's complicated because it's wrapped up with all other kinds of views I have, or opinions really. I don't even know if they're floated, but there's like opinions I have. But I think the thought is just like on the fence. And part of the reason for that is because I do think representational theory is right. And so I think that there's vehicles. I just don't think neuroscience finds evidence for vehicles. I think that, and this is cognitive neuroscience to be clear, but I think like if you're a cognitive neuroscientist and you're committed to representations, you're using that theory to go find properties in the brain that are interesting rather than like confirming representational theory. And I think vehicle realists are saying something like, there's evidence for representational theory coming from neuroscience. I think that's where I'm off. Oh. Yeah. But I'm happy with the on the fence because it's just it feels like early stages for like understanding. The candidate vehicles are just so disparate that it's clear we don't even have the first step for like figuring out what's going on. Maybe spikes are like pretty close. Maybe there's something there, but we're like not sure. So I'm on the fence. Yeah. Thanks.
I was just wondering if you could clarify something. I was wondering if you could clarify something about what a vehicle is. I look back. I think back at the map example that you gave at the very beginning, and you said that the vehicle was like the lines and shapes. And I'm wondering, in this kind of conception, how granular you go, and how the vehicle is not the pixels or the like shape of a giraffe or like whatever. Like, how do you know what part is the vehicle?
That's a great question. I get confused about this because I think there is like object indeterminacy issues for sure with like how to individuate objects generally. And so that might just come up in the brain because the brain is so complex and there's so much going on. Like, how do you mark the boundaries with synapse? There's like probably various like, interesting ways to do that, but like what the way is probably isn't like there's probably no answer to that question. So the way that I'm thinking about it for something like those public representations, like aside from the object intrinsics, I'm not sure, but but there it's by convention that we're individuating vehicles. I'm trying to think of another example, because words, when you're individuating words, that's also by convention. It's like by configurations. There's like some configuration that you take to be meaningful. But I don't know if that's answering your question quite. Yeah. Could I invite you to expand more if you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it in the context of like what you said, the list of like all of these could be candidates for, in like the computational side, could be candidates for being a vehicle. I was wondering, what are the qualities that like make it not the full high dimensional thing, or it's some component of it? I just don't know what the criteria are.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So yeah, what I loosely have in mind, and I don't have necessarily sufficient conditions for vehicle status, and part of my like dissertation project is maybe to come up with something like that. Would be super cool. But yeah, I think when I'm thinking back to like the methodology here, like I have in mind this kind of structure where, so it's the activity sits in a causal role. It causes behavior. You can manipulate it to cause that behavior. And then the behavioral paradigm matters quite a bit because it's whatever's happened in the behavioral paradigm is going to tell you what the content is. And I think part of the problem why I don't have a good like criteria for this is vehicle status is because it could always be that pattern is playing some non-representational role, like some supportive role for the behavior that we wouldn't say is like it's carrying information for the researcher but not for the brain, might be another way of putting it. And so there's like these issues I come up with where I'm like, I don't know how you would distinguish that. And I think that's why I just think that there's indeterminacy. But I think you're right that it would be good to just like come in and be like, this is what I want out of you to identify vehicles. And I just don't have that.
Absolutely. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Any other questions? Oh.
Hello? Is this working at all? A little bit? Okay. Thank you so much. That was so brilliant. I had a question kind of about the relation between this work and your stance on representationalism more generally. I mean, you just said that you are a sort of representationalist, but I wondered if this work poses a challenge even to non-representationalist theories, because insofar as you have vehicles for anything, regardless of whether they're representations or behaviors or whatever, you're going to be in trouble if we accept the indeterminacy problem. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. Do you think that you're just addressing kind of fellow representationalists here, or how wide does your scope go?
Oh, but yeah, the question is like whether non-representational should also care.
Yeah.
I mean, yes and no. So for sure, the like problems I'm raising they're going to be most important for the people who are like, no, neuroscience has found vehicles. You might even say they observe vehicles or neural representations in their everyday practices. The kind of alternative theories that are non-representational, I don't know if they rely so much. I mean, I think some of these issues will still arise. So I'm thinking of like dynamical systems kind of approaches, and I kind of get at that towards the end. And if you're like studying the dynamics of a system, this is where it might matter, like, well, when you add new neurons and that the dynamics changes, are you doing something different, or are you getting a better capture of the dynamics? I think that question is really confusing. And then there might be like parallel distributed processing theories or things like this, where like more connectionist approaches or something. I think that the issues still arise there. So I think maybe the scope is bigger than representationalism, but I don't know if it's as because I feel like in all the cases it's just science proceeding as it should, but I don't know if they're as committed to like there's this thing that carries content like the representationalists are, and so maybe it's more strictly applied there. Yeah, I want to think more about that. It's an interesting question.
Thank you so much. This was great. This is going to be really basic because it's far outside my area. So when I saw your picture with PCA on it, it just made me want to ask you how you think scientists are thinking about simplicity versus complexity, or Occam's razor, or whatever else in their kind of search for these things, and whether it matters.
That's a good question. I don't know. So the neuroscientists I talk to, they're mostly graduate students, and they're all fun. But when I talk to them about stuff like this, they're like, isn't it just cool that like we can like, okay, one of them says tickle the brain. I think this is hilarious. They're like, we can like tickle the brain and do stuff, and that's so cool. And like, yeah. And like, and then like with more data analytic techniques, it's like, it's like fascinating that you can like pull all this data and actually distinguish task parameters. And so there's like this sense in which is like any way to simplify it and have an effect is like awesome. And I think that's like really good. But yeah, I'm not sure, because we asked that question, I'm thinking of something like, there's all this work on biological complexity and simplifying strategies, and I don't know how neuroscientists think about it. But is the thought kind of like, we want to get more of the complexity, or simplification is good enough, or?
I have no thoughts.
Yeah, okay, no, yeah.
It just makes me wonder. I mean, actually, maybe the other thing that made me think of this was when you were saying about like, oh, we're going to say it's computation or it's not computation. So I'm a computer scientist. And I was like, that's a really coarse question. Like, in computer science, we spill so much ink on the time complexity of algorithms and of the complexity you probably need to solve different kinds of problems. And so it just made me wonder if people ever make an argument that's like, I found a vehicle, and the reason I think it is because it's such a beautiful, simple explanation like we see in a lot of other places. But again, not a philosopher, just interested in your thoughts on that.
No, that's great. I think that's right. So there's like debates about whether to treat the brain as literally computing, and I'm on the side that, well, I'm going to say like no, but then also it's like if you're using the computer analogy. Actually, there's a really interesting paper I want to call out, Andrew, on this, that like there's like a usefulness to treating the brain computationally. And it's like it allows you to do certain things. And so I think that view is right. But then I also look at these like classic theories, like David Marr's theory or something like this, where they're like, okay, here's the computation it must be performing, and then we're going to use that to go look for properties. And I think that's a great strategy. And so, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how, because there's a lot with like a computer science and computational neuroscience, and a lot of the resources are used in both. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how neuroscientists think about it, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is just kind of a quick follow-up to that. This doesn't seem, is this working?
It's just for the camera.
Oh, okay. So we're not getting any recoil. I wanted to ask, so, and this is a follow-up and it relates to some of the other questions. I mean, could the whole organism be the vehicle? Like, when you were talking, and that's related to complexity, simplicity. I mean, when you were talking, like, I was getting caught up on the fact that, well, a neuron is a thing, and it can be a vehicle, but can a pattern be a vehicle? A pattern of neurons firing be a vehicle? Like, these seem like different kinds of things that are all being lumped into the same vehicle category. And and I'm just wondering, is it the stuff or is it what the stuff is doing? And is it perspectival? It seems to be, and yeah, anyway. So, sorry, that was just a lot, but I just wondered if that kind of
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I think perspectivism, I'm inclined to think that that's kind of the right take. The whole body stuff I think is really interesting, because you'll read the 4E stuff, and the 4E people are like, no representations. But I'm like, we can still talk about it representationally, but it just looks like the representation might be the body, or maybe the body in its environment. So there's definitely also vehicle issues there. I mean, the whole project of dissertation was trying to figure out what vehicles are for the exact reason that you're raising here, because if you are someone I started out focusing on memory engrams. And I'm like, okay, well, the vehicle there's going to be the actual neurons, because people are like, oh, there's engram neurons, and they're storing memory. But then if you're looking at spikes, then it's the activity. And so I'm like, well, what's the vehicle here? And the best I could come up with is this diagram where I'm like, okay, well, they seem to think that there's vehicle realizers, and then there's some activity, and that all of that's the vehicle for representation. But it really isn't clear, and I think people use the term in all sorts of different ways, and neuroscientists don't even use the term, and so we're like kind of like projecting it onto the science. The closest thing is neural representations, but even there, like there's some recent work showing that they have different conditions for what neural representations are, and so there might not even be agreement about those. So yeah, it's a total mess, and that's my attempt to try to clean it up, but I don't think it captures all the views. So there's definitely variation.
No, I really enjoyed the talk, honestly.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for this amazing presentation. And I'm a kind of layman to this question, so I want to have a very simple question. I'm confusing about indeterminacy of vehicle and indeterminacy of individuation of vehicles. By the former, I mean, I know those paints are representing like animals, and by the later, I mean, I want to know which one is representing dog. So the individual vehicles means we need to find like a certain neuron pattern that is representing a specific content. So if we cannot robustly identify like a neuroactive pattern for a certain content, I think the problem might also be something wrong with the content of the representation.
Yeah.
We might find the wrong content. So that's the reason we cannot find a like robust vehicle for that content. I think this corresponds to something in computer science, like we find some representations in like a visual detecting model. Like you want to find a representation of nose. The content of representation is not a linguistic nose. It's like a very weird picture of nose that is very different from the content we are talking about, like a nose and nothing else. So I just confusing about how to distinguish these two.
I think it's a great question. I think that's a very serious issue that cognitive neuroscientists confront and computational neuroscientists. Because you might think like even the behavioral paradigms, I mean, they're designed in such a way that we think like, okay, well, the animal to have survived this far for their species, they must have this ability, they must be able to track this thing. And so they'll try to isolate that. But the behavioral paradigms aren't exact. And there's been calls, I think most famously by John Krakauer, to like focus on behavior and get more discriminate behavioral analyses to try to sort out different contents. But I think it's always going to be indeterminate for the reasons that philosophers have raised for in their debates. But I think there's like more or less serious content determinants. I think like being able to describe flies in various different ways seems like something like, okay, well, we can describe it in a bunch of different ways, but clearly the toad is tracking something in the environment. We know what that is. But I think you're right that like in neuroscience, it's not clear that that like we could say like, oh, we know what it's tracking from this pattern of neural activity. It could be something else. That's the issue you're raising?
Yes, I'm just wondering. The indeterminacy of vehicles are just because we didn't find the right content.
Yeah. So I think even if we have, so there's content determinants issues for sure. I agree that there is. I'm not sure if I think that even if you have the right content, it's still going to be unclear. Just like currently, I guess, what the vehicle is, and because what I have in mind is something like what's happening with the computational theories. If I'm like, okay, for sure, that animal is representing the foot shocks it received in that cage last week or a couple days ago or whatever, because it's like freezing and it looks scared, and so it's representing the foot shocks. There's still various ways to carve out and figure out and like carve out the system to say like that's the vehicle for the foot shocks, because you can get information about that in many different places in the brain. You can focus on synapses or molecules or populations of neurons. So I think the issue is still there, even if the content indeterminacy problem is resolved. But I think that it's super exacerbated from the content indeterminacy that arises just from having to use coarse behavioral paradigms.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Caitlin.
Thank you.